Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Alena Kudzko.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on the morning. I hope you didn't have too long of a night, and thank you so much for joining us here in this room. We're going to be talking about building the foundations, compute infrastructure, and security for competitive AI deployment. But first and foremost, I want to welcome on stage our speakers for today. We have with us Ben Crampton, who is Director for European Government Affairs at Microsoft. Welcome, Ben. We also have with us Pervinder Johar, who is CEO of Avathon. Welcome, Pervinder. And we have with us Michal Valko, who is Chief Models Officer at Stealth AI startup. Welcome, Michal. During the course of yesterday, and especially at the Geotech Summit segment of the conference, we talked extensively about the need for Europe to focus on AI deployment, AI diffusion, and make sure that AI is introduced in all sectors of economy and society. What we did not talk about that much yesterday is what it actually takes to make it happen. We have this ambition, but this ambition can crash at the reality of the either physical constraints or things that we do not have put in place to make sure that we can ensure the AI diffusion and rollout. That's exactly what we're going to be discussing today with the speakers on stage. But before we do that, I guys want you to just tell us a few words about yourself, tell us what you are doing, to give a little bit of a background and the angles from which you're going to be coming. Michal, and I'll start with you from the other side.
I'm Michal. I've been doing AI for 25 years. I built first face recognizer at Intel. I created DeepMind Paris. I've been teaching AI for 15 years. My grad students created companies like Mistral, Qt, and others. I was recruited directly by Mark Zuckerberg last year to train Llama 3, and now I work on a startup. I'm also academic and advise about 25 AI startups.
Michal, I would like to be your student.
I think we all would.
Pervinder, please go ahead.
I've been doing technology for more than 35 years now. Started off with building distributed control systems and started using the first neural networks back in '89. They were simple. They were two. So long history. I've been the CEO for 4 different startups over the years. And in between, I also worked for Hewlett-Packard. So it's good to be back in Prague, because back in 2008-9, we actually ended up setting 3 factories in the Czech Republic. So a fair amount of experience, kind of for 2 for PCs and 1 for servers, kind of here too. So know the infrastructure a little bit. Currently, CEO of Avathon. We are a physical AI company, and we'll talk more about what it really means, kind of to have an infrastructure for physical AI, which is slightly different than kind of things like ChatGPT and others.
Perfect. Welcome back to Prague. Ben.
So, I'm Ben Crampton. I'm definitely the odd man out here because I do not come from a technology background at all, even though I now work for a technology company. I joined Microsoft 3.5 years ago. I was previously a diplomat, working mainly on conflict, and mainly in Western Balkans, North Caucasus, and then in East Africa for a long time. And so coming into the technology world has been a real departure for me. But I mean, I think it's been fascinating, and I think these discussions that we're coming on to now about how we need to prepare as societies for a huge change that's going to come as a result of the implementation and diffusion of AI, but also in terms of the resilience and making sure that it all functions together seamlessly and with minimal disruption is going to be I'm looking forward to the discussion, but it comes back to my past a little bit.
Perfect. So we have a perfect lineup with diverse angles to cover. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to start with a few questions to the speakers. But we also would be excited to bring you all in. There are 2 ways to do that. Please raise your hand at any moment if you would like to jump in and ask a question. I'll be monitoring the room and make sure that you have an opportunity. We also have the Slido app, and you can type in your questions online, and we see the screen here, so they will be coming in live to us. Please keep doing that during the entire discussion, and we'll make sure we can get in as many people as possible. But let's start with the first question. What it actually takes to make sure that we can have AI roll out? What kind of infrastructure needs to be in place? And of course, it's a pretty broad set of factors that need to come together. So while you're talking about that, I would also want you to mention something that you think Europe is not probably thinking about enough, or where you think we are facing most consequential choke points in Europe. And Michal, let's start with you.
Yes, so I think so. There are multiple things that we need to do for AI, right? So there are data centers, there is data itself, there is energy, there is chips, there is talent, right? And so depending on which project we want to do, there is a different proportion of how much we need to invest in that, right? And so it's kind of on the policymakers that are here to decide what to do. I think the good example is Canada, because I think in Europe we try to do everything a little bit, and Canada is decided, well, we're going to only invest in these 4 things, but when we really do a lot of investment within this direction. I think committing to one thing, because one thing that's quite difficult for startups is not necessarily the regulation, but the changing regulation, like non-stability. Like we say, well, for next 15 years, we're going to invest in this direction and we're going to back every single thing that's going to be, right? Like there is very dangerous things that, okay, well, next 6 months we were doing that, and then we completely change. So there's things that, we are good at, right? Like, for example, we are good in these countries, or in France, where I spend half of my time, in nuclear energy, right? So even UAE comes to France because, that's very good for data, like the clusters, hyperscalers, right? Like, they produce a lot of heat. They need to be cooled, right? And so first you need those energy, and we should not build them in the hot areas, right? A lot of things are talent, right? So we need to educate people to get that, right? Like that's why I was spending a lot of time in education. I've been teaching grad courses for 15 years, but also here in Europe and Eastern Europe, like with friends in DeepMind, we started a thing called Eastern European Machine Learning. So every time we pick the country where there is no machine learning experts, and we build them, bring them, so I organize it in my hometown in Košice. This year will be in, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and exactly those countries, right? Because it's very difficult for people that do PhD here, just go for 2 months in Japan for machine learning summer school that would cost 5,000 euros. There is no even resources for that. Then one thing that's lacking specifically. And for example, one thing that my student in Mistral could not just stay in Europe, and they had to open 40 people lab in San Francisco, is exactly if you need people that are good in specific things in chips, for example, good CUDA. CUDA is one of the underlying, let's say, software that governs the chip, or nickel. They are in San Francisco, right? So there is NVIDIA, there is AMD, there is Intel. So those people are not here, right? We have ASML in Eindhoven, but we don't educate people in those things, and there's no clusters of, let's say, excellence in this kind of stuff. So for example, in those things are behind, and in those things, China is catching up tremendously, right? But UAE is, building factories, and so we are, observing for now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So what we have from you is energy, but with a focus on energy that you can produce cheaply and scale. In some cases, it's nuclear in Europe. We have talent, and we have the clusters and ability to draw on the adjacent expertise. Pervinder, you're next.
I think if I pick up on your point on talent, and I'm based in San Francisco Bay Area as well, at the company headquartered in Austin, and we ended up moving to San Francisco primarily because of the culture and the ecosystem that you have for innovation. I think I will go more on that, not just the cluster part in there for Europe in particular. If you think of China is doing well, kind of in India, Bangalore comes to mind. If I think of Europe, don't really know what comes to mind as a place to go.
Prague. It should be Prague.
It should be Prague, yes, but it doesn't come to mind today. So I think talent, and that talent along with the culture of innovation is it is absolutely required. But maybe I will step back a little bit more, because AI is not just one thing. And it's kind of, one, it depends on what type of an AI algorithms we are even talking about too. So, and many people confuse kind of, it's just a one thing. It's a broad area with many different applications, whether it's reinforcement learning, large language model, natural language processing, all of them have even different infrastructure requirements. And so people have tended to kind of go and say, the number one thing I need is very large data centers, and I need a lot of energy to do AI. But if you think of a remote mine or an oil rig or any of these things, there are so many applications of AI. Or talking about defense, a naval ship which needs to be disconnected from the rest of the world, but you still have many of these applications of AI that can happen. So my first one is that just think of kind of which part of the AI are we talking about. Especially when we talk about the defense as a sector in there, it's not necessarily going to be these large public data centers. And so much of the compute will really be on the edge. And what happens today, that we have a lot of data. If I take an oil rig, it can produce about 5 terabytes of data a day. You're not going to move it to a public cloud kind of in there. You're going to be that, how do I go process it? Very different problem to go solve. And the same thing happens in defense settings, right? Whether it's in a conflict zone and you're looking at conflict logistics, you're not really going to be moving data around, and what are you processing? At the same time, if you're talking about kind of public health, kind of there's a lot of things that need to be happen at scale for a country or for a geography as a whole. So my first caution is just kind of just step back, define what are we even talking about, both from the technology perspective and what the applications are. And depending on the application, the needs are different too. Hope that makes sense, especially kind of in this conference when I think of defense, the needs are very different than what it will be kind of purely for education or health or other things, which are equally important, but different.
I just want to do one very specific example, an excellent point that you mentioned, the kind of like innovation mindset, and that's why I spend half of my time in San Francisco, is that, you know, if I talk to people in Slovakia or even in France, studying even computer science or AI, their hope is, to get a good job, maybe startup. And the one that dream big is like get to companies like, DeepMind or Meta, OpenAI. People in San Francisco, for them, is a failure. If you work for somebody else, when they're young, they go to meetups, they read books of founders, they want to create their company themselves. So that's kind of like completely different mindset. Not to get somewhere so you have it easy, but actually to create something better than something that exists. And so that's why we find in San Francisco, and you made excellent point. And that's why I'm there, and that's why half of my people work there.
Yeah. We'll follow up on that moment in a little bit more detail because it's important. We'll already have a few questions coming in on that one. But Pervinder, thank you so much for highlighting that there are different use cases and different ways to think about AI and what you need for the requirements. In some ways, it's actually good news for Europe because I think the worry here was that because we don't have all this mass scale infrastructure, we'll never succeed. And that's the problem where everybody was obsessed about and focused. Whereas what you're saying is that you can do a lot while doing that in parallel. You already can do a lot in different types of applications. Ben, let's go to you next.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I say is actually Europe does have that large-scale infrastructure, and it's built by the large hyperscalers. I mean, we're on course to have 200 data centers in Europe. We've invested 18 billion euros in the past year. We're expecting to invest a similar amount in the coming period, and of course that's just Microsoft. There are also the other large US companies, and European companies are getting much bigger as well. So there is a very large-scale private infrastructure investment in Europe. And I think it comes on to an interesting question about the role of government. Because I really do understand the concern in Europe at a governmental level about the lack of, if you like, native infrastructure in Europe. That is changing from the private sector perspective. As I say, European cloud providers are becoming much larger. But I think, coming back to Pervinder's point, this is exactly the right point. There is a space here for a lot of different forms of infrastructure and a lot of different kinds of ecosystems. There will be space for the large-scale infrastructure that we're building out, the big data centers, and sort of large language models directed towards mass consumer and mass business uptake. But there will also be lots of edge applications, as Pervinder says, particularly in the defense market, which is my own focus. I think the second thing I say is that I think there are many ways in which Europe is different, and Pervinder and Michal have already talked about this, but one of the ways in which Europe is different is that there is a tendency here to be led more by the public sector than is the case in the US. So one of the things that the European governments can best do to encourage AI adoption in Europe is to adopt it more themselves. That is it's an important starting point. There is a huge role for governments to play as exemplars in the use of AI in their own systems, and as a means of encouraging AI uptake amongst businesses. There was an encouraging report, I think, from the Geotech Center on this, which we talked about yesterday, which actually indicated that on its own statistics that AI uptake amongst European businesses was slightly higher than it was in the US, which was a surprise to me. But I think we can be safe in assuming that it's lower in both cases, Europe and the US, than it is in China. And one of the reasons for that is that the Chinese government has been very, very far-reaching in its own adoption of AI and its encouragement of businesses in China to do that. So there is a role for government, and it also comes back to Michal's point about ensuring that there's a stable regulatory environment in Europe, which has been the case historically. And that's an important thing for investment. In the case of ecosystems, I think the lesson of the past is that ecosystems are quite hard to create artificially. They tend to grow organically, but there are centers of AI excellence in Europe. Paris is one. I'm sure that's why you spend a lot of time there. You mentioned Eindhoven. My wife is Dutch, so she'd be very pleased to hear that. There are these places, and I think it's more a matter of encouraging the clustering, doing what governments can to remove barriers to the creation of businesses, including physical barriers. I mean, again, building a data center isn't just a matter of sort of finding a piece of land. It's the permitting process. You need to have access to water. You need to ensure access to energy. This can be a long-winded process. If you want to encourage business uptake and you want to encourage businesses to cluster, creating the regulatory conditions in which that's relatively quick and easy to do is a very important step.
Thank you so much, Ben. I remember last year when Brad Smith was here, he said that permitting is one biggest concern, and half-jokingly he was saying that the best project Microsoft could do is to create an AI system who is going to be filling out all the applications and walking through the permitting system in Europe. But I just want to follow up very briefly on one thing that Michal was talking about, and that's the energy. There's a lot of discussion that it is actually a very huge constraint on the ability in Europe to do hyperscale projects and roll out data centers. Is that an issue for you from your practical experience so far with Microsoft?
Energy is one of three constraints, essentially, the other two being land and water. But energy is a constraint, it is a concern, partly also because of the commitments that we and other companies have made to ensure that all the energy we use to power data centers comes from carbon neutral sources. And we have a commitment as a company to be carbon negative by 2030. Now, when you're talking about very large increases in data center capacity, that comes with very large increases in the consumption of energy. It's one of the questions that's here. I think Microsoft is not unique in committing to source that energy sustainably, but of course that requires, we cannot produce that energy directly ourselves beyond putting solar panels on the roofs of our data centers. We do, in fact, actually invest in energy infrastructure in Europe and in the US. But essentially, it is much more down to the grid capacity of the areas in which we operate, and the quickest way in which grid capacity in Europe as a whole can be expanded is simply by making it more European and less national, because then you can spread the loads of renewable energy across the continent more efficiently. But that comes with all sorts of complications that Pervinder knows more about than I do. So.
And on that point, indeed, that like when we're talking about making it European and using the territory that's available not just for the nation state, for Europe, there are a lot of questions that come with that, and these concerns about the sovereignty in Europe come very much into place. One of them is how you move data and who owns the data and where the data is processed, and that's again in itself might be a constraint if you want to do scaling in Europe. We talk a lot about digital single market. Everybody's from the business side saying that that's not quite the reality right now. But Michal, going back to you, can you elaborate a little bit on this ability to scale across borders in Europe, either when it comes to data mobility or any other constraints that you see right now?
I think we need to think it from the point of the stakeholder, who is using, right? Citizens or users, they want their data to be secure, and they want it to be accessible. The companies want it to be sustainable without barriers, and government want to, have some kind of oversight, right? And so, all these things need to be placed. And oftentimes we have those discussions that are very vague, right? I have friends, AI, they've been there for even longer than me, they're 60, 70 years old. One of them wants to stop it completely, and one of them to do completely unchanged regulation. But I think the answer is not either, right? A lot of times we're missing people in the room that are really dealing with those incentives. Why users should be, why the companies, why the investors should invest on those companies. We rarely talk about incentives with AI, right? But people that are really good in incentives is economists. We often, we have politicians, we have AI people, but where are the economists? Where we need to create systems, then for investor will be incentivized to work. For users, they will be incentivized to provide their data. And I think those discussions are missing the most, right? So create market creation. For some of my first, it's also operation research and market design. I can give you a very specific example, right? In Paris, we don't want to have cars right now. We are a green mayor, so we close the street and make them pedestrian, right? Or you take the things like US, Detroit, right? All the cars. But for me, the great example is London. You want to go to the city, you pay £2, and then you can decide if it's £2, £1, or £3, right? And so these are incentives, right? We don't, you let the technology developed, you don't regulate it. You create incentives that you maximize social welfare, such that people are incentivized to do the right thing. And so here, we want, users are incentivized to use AI. And one thing that a lot of companies, and even the companies that my students create are, sometimes overlooking, you want the AI to be integrated in the workflows, right? You want AI to do something for you, something that's useful. We just don't want big chatbot that you could talk to, right? You want do something that you couldn't do that before, the way that you're wanting it. I think that's important. Create incentives and have incentivized behavior that AI would be integrating to the workflow and do social good, in the sense we want it, right?
Right, and you're right. Even from the way how we approach it in Europe, but probably in some other places, the conversation is more how you're going to be punished if something is going to go wrong. And that's, of course, if that's the primary, that's one certainty that people know is what's going to happen to them if things go wrong. But they are not entirely sure what if everything's go right, and what is the weights between the success and failure of the particular enterprise. But Pervinder, I'm really fascinated by your experience in Europe before. Just continuing the conversation about incentives, what do you think could work?
I think so. My prior experience in Europe was, as I mentioned, with Hewlett-Packard. So I had global responsibilities for all manufacturing and supply chain. So all Europe was part of it. And there was movement of factories from Scotland to Czech Republic and kind of warehouses and others. And reality was that in the end, in the context of, at that time we were a Fortune 9 company, in the end it all ended up working out well as if you have a single kind of HP in Europe at that time, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, EU or no EU. So my personal experience was kind of pretty positive from that perspective, that we didn't really feel like that there are a bunch of boundaries. Now, there were regulations that you had to go do it. But I wanted to go back to actually the data sharing point that you talked about it too. Who amongst us would ever want to live without a map? And how do these maps work? Whether it's Bing Map or the Google Map and others, if none of us share data on our own location, the maps don't work. But this was one of the cases which is a very great example of across the globe data sharing by people willingly, and it is all individuals, which is kind of how Waze came along, which is what Google Maps is, which is why kind of all maps have become that kind of you have to somehow figure out what's the right region to share data across borders. Right? Now, these are individuals now, and all governments were involved at that time. Kind of if you look through the history of how kind of it started on building a map technology that all of us use, each and every one of us shares the data with the map provider, and in return, we get something that we get kind of traffic information. We get kind of when will we get there, right? Too. And then I think these days, I took an Uber this morning because I'm not staying, and we're always watching that. Where is that kind of Uber car kind of in there coming in? But I take that as a point that when we talk about the data sharing across borders within Europe or across the globe, if you first define what the purpose is and what the value is out of it, that's the right conversations to start off with, versus just a conversation that I've seen many times that, no, we need to share all the data about us. Even yesterday, there was discussions about the citizens between UK and EU and how do we go share data about it. But I don't really know where the conversation is starting. If you start off with the purpose of data sharing in there, then I think it's a lot more easier conversation to go have in all of these cases versus purely a theoretical conversation that how do you go share.
Right, and it's actually an incentive in itself why people would be more likely to be.
Yeah, because
Ben, I feel like you want to jump in on that point, and if not, I have another question for you that we have from the room. And there are actually quite a few, but I want to pick up on the conversation that we started about the culture and ecosystem. There is a question coming in, whether Europe ever has a chance to create an ecosystem or the culture that would resemble something that you described exists already in San Francisco. And the key question is, Ben, you mentioned that it's very hard to create it artificially, but at the same time, what are the incentives that the governments can provide? But I'll also add a dimension, what are the incentives that the bigger companies like Microsoft can provide? Because you invest a lot in even countries across the region, and that stimulates in itself the pool of people who are coming in, the pool of other companies who are working with you across different locations.
Yeah, it does. I think, as I say, I think it is hard to create these clusters artificially. There have been multiple attempts at it, and not only in Europe. And none of them have really succeeded. Where these hubs and ecosystems have grown, they've tended to grow organically. But what is interesting, we talked about this yesterday, but I'll repeat what I said in a side session yesterday. If you think about this, if you like, this nervousness in Europe at the moment that Europe is falling behind in the technology race. It was a very similar feeling, actually, that the US had 40 years ago in regard to Japan. At that time, the perception in the US was that Japan was far ahead in the technology race. In fact, a lot of the technology that was later, if you like, utilized and expanded out of San Francisco was actually developed in Japan. So the question is not so much who creates this technology, it's who uses it and creates the springboard off which it becomes hugely beneficial and magnified. And there's another example, I think, and I used to work on this region. It's one I feel very strongly about: mobile telephony in Africa. Until very recently, the Safaricom's M-Pesa system in Kenya was by far the most advanced mobile money system in the world. You have essentially people having their bank accounts exclusively through their SIM cards. And it was a system that was developed entirely in Kenya for the Kenyan market. It's now been expanded across a lot of Africa. The mobile technology in question was not developed in Africa, but the application and the use of it and the way in which it was conceived differently and conceived as allowing people to have a bank in their pocket, that was new. It was an entirely different way of thinking about finance and about the value of technology. So the fact that, if you like, this technology is perceived as having been developed and exported from the US, that's probably my beard, that doesn't have to mean that it cannot be magnified, utilized, and made European in its application. And that's where the business opportunity truly lies. We provide the infrastructure, we provide the data centers after all of this will run. But it will run European systems for European companies, and that's what it does. So coming back to your question, I think if you look at the Czech Republic, and you mentioned Prague as a hub, for us it is a hub. For Microsoft, it's our biggest engineering hub in Europe. And I find that interesting for two reasons. One is, it wasn't necessarily what we would have expected, but it has become our biggest engineering hub in Europe, partly because, and Michal knows this better than me, STEM is taught very, very strongly in Central East European universities. There's a long tradition of very good STEM teaching in this part of the world, and there's a lot of graduates in this part of the world. But interestingly, coming back to the report that that came out of the Geotech Center yesterday, it's the part of Europe in which AI adoption by business is lowest. So there's a gradation as you go from west to east in Europe, whereby AI adoption by businesses gets less and less and less as you go east and south. So you have a paradox, which is you have this huge pool of talent, Michal included, coming from this part of the world, but most of them, just as, there's a brain drain from east to west in Europe as there is from Europe to the US at the moment. So there is a question of creating ecosystems to take advantage of the talent we have. Prague is a good example for us. I think we just have to find the ways of allowing those to grow organically, as I say, and part of that is extending the value of the single market, which you've talked about, and allowing companies that are based in one country to properly expand into others. That is still difficult. Access to capital for startups is a huge problem. Microsoft will invest in some, but it's not going to invest in all. There has to be a local venture capital market that can be there to scale up these companies. And that's another thing that San Francisco has that Europe does not have at the same scale. There is the culture as well, the culture of failure, as you say. That is a harder one to talk about and to deal with. But I think partly that you can argue about what's cause and what's effect. Are people willing to fail in the US because they know they will have access to capital if they fail, because the second idea is still good enough to invest in? Or is there a culture of willingness to fail that creates a capital investment market that is willing to take that risk? I don't know the answer, but it may well be that it's the first.
These are great points, and thank you also for pointing out the talent and the discrepancy between people actually having the skills and working for companies, but in a way it goes back to what Michal is saying. What we are doing well in Europe is indeed the engineering training, but probably the difference is that the people who go through this training, they do not necessarily are equally aware or capable of working in market realities. They know how to program, but they do not know how necessarily these skills can be commercialized or how to operate a business. And maybe this is one intervention that can be done both on the public side, but also on the private side, to a little bit merge the skills that people have on the engineering side, but make sure that they're also transportable and used for either running your own business or thinking about how you can integrate AI into the local business that you are doing here. I'll bring in people from the audience, and we have one hand over there.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Tobias Elwood. I'm a former defense minister from the United Kingdom. And some of us have been coming to these security conferences for a long time, and it's a testament to the power of the digital world that the good people like you are taking an ever more prominence at these events. Now, I wonder whether you could humor me and calm me down, because I'm seeing a very large elephant in the room, and maybe it's just me. But if it isn't just me, then hopefully perhaps you can provide a solution. My concern is that there's actually a new arms race when it comes to AI, and particularly when it comes to quantum computing. And Ben and I had this discussion yesterday. So this elephant in the room is whoever gets there first. That's what I'm seeing. The prize is substantial. It's not only substantial, it's existential. So could I invite the panel to say, am I imagining things? Am I seeing elephants? Or should I just calm down and everything's fine? Or if you do agree with me, is it time for a Manhattan Project where the good people such as yourselves link in with governments, link in with the academics, and actually make sure that we win this new arms race? Because otherwise it is game changing and the world will look very, very different. And it's in the next 2 to 5 years. Thank you very much indeed.
Tobias, thank you so much for that. That's an excellent point. And I'll make it even more high stake and plug in another report that we did. We compared digitalization and AI deployment in the militaries across the world with a focus on China, Russia, which is the red theme, but also on what we're doing in Western countries or countries like South Korea and Taiwan. And of course, like it's probably well understood that Chinese are moving well ahead, but what was interesting for us is to see that Russia is also underappreciated from the point of view how much, again, they do not invent the technology, but they're extremely good in taking whatever they get and deploying them at scale, and not just doing it for their own militaries, but they also now very efficiently sell these capabilities to plenty of actors across the globe. So there's a huge AI diffusion for defense sector that's stemming out from Russia. But now for the difficult part, the answers and the solution, we'll go back to you and Ben. No, Ben, you were just speaking, so Pervinder, you're going to go next.
I think the AI race and the quantum race is very real, and then the price is very big. So you're absolutely right about kind of both of those things. What I'm not clear on is that kind of is there only one winner take all, or is it not? Right. So if I go through kind of not to bring kind of there are companies in our history kind of which were the best innovators on the technology side, but could never really scale it, right? So the point you're talking about, kind of like Russia, is that even if you don't invent it, there were many other companies who were able to scale it so much better. So the prize actually did not really go to the inventors. It ended up going to the people who knew how to scale it well. And I think it's not easy to jump into this race at this point, right? So as you talk about it, it's 2 to 5 years away, and people have been investing kind of like you decades, kind of just working on it, and we're getting towards the end of where all of it has come together in the last 2 to 3 years, right? So if you think of even DeepMind was about 10 years back or so when kind of Google got involved or so. So it was not yesterday, kind of it was 10 years back to begin with. So I don't know if the collaboration now on that let's go create something like a Manhattan Project is where we are, because it's already underway in there. And then whether it's China or US and Western countries, kind of the advances are kind of significant. But scaling and adoption of it and diffusion and how do you go monetize it and how do you go do it, that's kind of where I think there can be a lot more collaboration. For Europe, the broader impressions continues to be that it's more risk averse than US is to some extent. And I think that risk averseness on adoption might be a bigger issue than on innovation. And I think that's kind of where I would focus on that kind of, because it's still joking aside about permitting, but permitting is an example of kind of how adoption can take a long time, whether it's for mining that we were talking about yesterday, or it's for data center and others, kind of there's a lot of regulations which can slow it down. But I think the focus, if it was more on that, it's going to happen, it's coming, and I call it kind of, it's already foreseen that it's coming. It's a train which is going to go hit you in kind of 2 miles from now. Either get out of the way or do something about it. It's kind of how it seems to look like. So I will focus more on that. How do you go adopt it, and kind of how do we go prepare ourselves that we are not really the one standing in front of the train, versus we are on the train to begin with.
Perfect. And Michal, I'll bring you in. Do we need a Manhattan Project in Europe? And if so, how would you design it?
So let me address the race and the brain drain with specific example where things are working, right? Like so, it's true, you know, like has been said, right? Like Europe is great in STEM, and then people go to US, right? And so I have a lot of people that, you know, I've been involved in like mathematical input for like, I don't know, 30 years, you know, as a solver, and like prepare kids to go to IMO. Most of them are professors or startuppers in the US. But some of them, you know, thanks to involvement of, we can call it Manhattan Project of UAE, you know, there is a UAE university, UAE created university on AI. So my first professor in Carnegie Mellon, Eric Xing, is a head of University Embedded UAI. And, you know, even his own professor, Mike Jordan, who is like probably the biggest star in the whole AI, right? Like Joshua Bengio is his student, is also teaching in UAE, right? So, it was possible to bring people from the US, including my Slovak friends. One of them is a professor in UAE, another one is in Saudi, and these are like the talents that were, decades in US, because now, and this is not that Europe doesn't do it, and even some Europe is even another positive example. Bavaria last year created a university of AI in Nuremberg, and in September there will be first students attending it. So even Europe can have capital and track, and it's and it's succeeding. I have very bright friends in DeepMind, quitting DeepMind in London with good salary, good career, to go teach in Nuremberg, in Bavaria, right? And so we are also able to do something against brain drain and also winning part of the race. So things are not that bad. I think I would say maybe finish all this thing. Yes, we are behind, right? No question, right? Like not, but doesn't mean that, if we are behind and so we are, sometimes like the first adopters make most mistakes. Let me give you another concrete example. I like concrete example, right? So in 44, US invented color television with this NTCS, so it's compatible with old system, right? In Europe, we're like, black and white for like 20 years. When we came with PAL and SECAM standards in 60s, right? 15 years ago, and it was much better than US color TV, right? I remember that. Same, we are behind, US is great in adoption and addressing regulations. China is very good in under-resourced, right? There was restriction not to have H100, GPU processors. Like Jensen created H800, that were worse. But DeepSeek used some of the worst processor to be genuine and use some of them for creating something with worse processor, right? And I think what we should do in Europe is take advantage of the board. We should take this under-resource thing, that under-resource create this ingenuity. And we should also learn from mistakes in US to have this early adoption, war rooms regulations to address things very quickly, and as we saw, like both of those places do mistakes, and we can learn both. As we learn with color television, I think we can do excellent in AI too.
Ben, do you want to jump in on this one?
I will quickly. We did talk about it yesterday, so I won't take very long on this. I think the Manhattan Project is a if you haven't read Richard Rhodes' The Making of the Atomic Bomb, I do recommend it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. And partly it's just because of the way in which this process developed. And it was that strange concatenation of events where essentially a group of eccentric, exiled academics, as they were perceived by the US military, pitched this idea. And it was sufficiently interesting that the resources of the United States government were put at the disposal of these academics, and the resources of US industry at the same time were put at the disposal of these academics. So you had a government-coordinated, privately implemented, academically driven exercise, which resulted in the creation of a fission weapon. It was an extraordinary experience. Is that replicable? I think the point about the Manhattan Project that's interesting, of course, it has had a single purpose, single outcome, the production of a single weapon. AI is a much more diffuse discussion, and what the question is, what are we creating a defensive capability, an offensive capability, both, neither? I think that the question that has to be, I think it's possible to think of this coalition being created and driven and being successful, but I think we have to think very carefully about what the use purpose is that's being driven toward. But in general, is there more space for public-private academic cooperation? Absolutely. And I think Michal's point about the UAE and Saudi showing an example in this direction is actually correct. I mean, the UAE has simply decided we're going to have a post-oil economy. It's going to be driven by AI and renewable energy. What do we need to invest now to create the conditions that we will be in the lead when that time comes? It's been a very purposefully driven exercise. They have the benefit of being a centralized decision-making system. That is not a blessing that the EU has. And one final point I'd make here is about money. Collectively, the EU disposes of a great deal of money, but it also has a great deal of different things it has to spend it on. And the result, generally speaking, is that you end up with amounts of money that sound large at face value, but in fact, over the period of time in which they're distributed, end up being not particularly significant. If this requires major investment, if the EU wants to invest in this at scale, the amounts of money involved are really, really quite large. And that has to be factored in, as does, it's a point that Michal made, and it's interesting that he mentioned the Nuremberg point. It's a grubby subject in Europe, but it has to be talked about, and that's salaries. One of the reasons that people go to the US is they get better paid. Okay, they don't get free healthcare, and that is a major incentive for people to stay in Europe, but they do get better salaries. So the salary question has to be addressed here. If we're going to be serious about this, people have to be incentivized. It's an individual incentive as well as the government incentive to be ready to commit to remaining and investing in Europe.
Yep. We have 3 minutes left, but we'll do a rapid fire, and there was one hand that I promised to address, so a quick question, and we'll give you quick answers.
Thanks. Very quick question based on the point that you said get on the train and use the technology. Europe did that. Facebook, Twitter, the Google infrastructure, TikTok. As a result, all of that infrastructure was weaponized against Europe, used by the Russians to destroy European democracy, without any control by the European governments. So Europe basically communicates with its citizens over infrastructure that it has no control over. The same thing probably would happen with AI. So how do we avoid that, and how does Europe make sure that we don't end up in the same situation?
I'll give everybody 35 seconds to answer it, so be specific and strategic. Michal, you go first.
Specific education and example, Sweden. You know, there is 80 people in Swedish cyber defense psychological protection, where they go as far as educate teenagers how to resist threats and fake news. I think this should need to be like European global level, because there's something that will not be able to protect. You know, it's not just, okay, well, we'll close kids' eyes and they will not be able to look at TikTok. No, like we educate them so they can, you know, discern truth from false.
Pervinder?
I think cybersecurity is the obvious point, but you also have with AI many of the ethical questions. So the type of safeguards that you have to put are so much more than kind of what it was for social media to begin with. And it's a topic in itself, so I'm probably just going to leave it at that. It's not only the cyber, but cyber is the absolute necessity, but then you also have kind of all the other type of safeguards.
Perfect. We've got cyber. And Ben, your last 15 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is, of course, in the end, it has come further under the control of European governments through various regulations passed in the past year or so. But that has also resulted in a desire to preemptively regulate technologies that are not properly developed yet, including AI. So the AI Act is something we are committed to implementing fully. But we would argue, and we have argued, that some of this regulation actually hampers European companies from being able to compete in the market and create their own companies, because the compliance burden of regulation is too high for them. We can afford it, but smaller companies cannot.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really liked Michal's observation that sometimes the first adopters make the most mistakes. So my call is to become the second wave of adopters, but do not make a mistake of not trying to adopt it at all. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Please stay in your seats, because the next session will begin momentarily, and it's going to be about EU's trade dilemma. And for now, thank you so much for our great panel.
Thank you.